When you think of our warriors that were hung there and the sacrifice that they made for me and all my people, it makes it a little bit easier to know that they sacrificed so we can have what we have today.
On August 17, 1862, four Dakota men murdered five white settlers near the Acton Township of Minnesota. This event sparked a war where both sides shed blood. The U.S. government forced the Native Americans to negotiate treaties for their land in exchange for goods and annuities and forced them to live on reservations. This caused turmoil and violence to erupt. The Dakotas' motive for killing the five white settlers was the lack of food, which was supposed to be supplied by the Lower Sioux Agency, and the lack of payments from the U.S. government, which were delayed. The United States government deceived and deprived the Dakota into giving up their land in order to fulfill the westward expansion of the U.S. mainland. Consequently, many violent conflicts took place, and the Dakota were left impoverished, which remains to this day. The name Dakota means ally. They were a peaceful tribe who would hunt and gather in the spring, cultivate crops, hunt game during summer, and have large annual hunts in the autumn season. In the winter, the Dakota would rest and feast on the supplies they had gathered and saved from prior years. All of that changed when they first encountered the European settlers. On September 23, 1805, Pike's Treaty, the first treaty of its kind, was presented to the Dakota. The terms, which the Dakota agreed to, stated that for every 100,000 acres of their land, they would receive $2,000. The United States military wanted to hold the land in case of a British invasion.
I think, for example, the 1805 Pike Treaty, it was the treaty that gave a bit of land that eventually a military post would be built on. But I think for many Dakota people, they saw that as being positive, in fact, because they thought being a place of trade. So having something closer to home, that seemed like a benefit. I believe that they did not understand this as they would be giving up that land for forever.
The 1837 treaties allowed for the United States government to obtain the land between the St. Croix and Mississippi rivers for new settlements in what is now Minnesota. The Dakota Indians received payments, provisions, and goods perpetually. However, they did not have the right to hunt or fish in the territories obtained by the United States. The Dakota Indians finally received their annuities on October of 1837. However, the provisions they received were insufficient in quantity and inferior in quality. The Treaty of Traverse des Sioux of July 23, 1851 requested that the Dakota give up ownership of modern Minnesota and a small part of South Dakota. In return, the Dakota would get $1,655,000, which was to be used for agriculture, schooling, medical care, and covering the cost of Indian removal in the United States. Similarly, the Treaty of Mendota of August 5, 1851, promised the Dakota new reservations along the Minnesota River, a promise that was never fulfilled. The continuation of treaties offered the Dakota more goods and food. However, if they did not comply, military pressure would be used against them by the U.S. The Dakota tribe did not have the option to refuse because they feared the might of the American army. They gave up their land and moved further upward in order for the United States to expand westward without Native American interference.
And then later on, it's like, well, we've gotten their lands and resources, we've got their annuity payments. Now really we don't need them anymore, and in fact, they're in the way. So the war comes at a time when the most Americans in Minnesota, who are primarily living in southern Minnesota, Dakota homelands, just really see the Dakota people as an impediment to progress, kind of in the way, and it would just be better if they could leave altogether.
By the 1860s, the Dakota Indians felt that their treaties with the United States government were no longer upheld, and they slowly starved from delayed goods, lacking foods that they were promised. They felt cheated by the Great Father, Abraham Lincoln. The Dakota relied on U.S. assistance to survive.
Do you think that the Dakota was right to engage in battle with the American government?
Even Ta Oyate Duta's response about, this is not a wise decision. You are not going to win this war, but I'll fight and die with you. But I think for many Dakota people, and not all, they felt like we have to stand for something. I know there's this phrase that I've often heard said, I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees.
Not long after, Dakota warriors attacked the Lower Sioux Agency, killing traders and various government employees. The Dakota continued their insurrection, attacking settlements along the Minnesota River Valley. Alarmed by the increasingly violent activity in the west, a U.S. Army echelon was sent from a nearby fort to cease fighting. However, they were ambushed by the Dakota warriors. The next day, the warriors assaulted Fort Ridgely. 2 days later, they did it again, keeping pressure on the fort until the Union reinforcements arrived to relieve the effort. The next day, the Dakota returned to attack New Ulm a second time and to engulf the settlement in fire. 32 townspeople died and more than 60 people were wounded. This battle marked the first true victory for the Dakota warriors. They continued their assaults for 4 months, knowing that they were against a powerful foe. On November 7, 1862, Alexander Ramsey, governor of Minnesota at that time, declared that the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. A group of close to 1,600 Dakota men, women, and children marched to Fort Snelling and were later kept in internment camps south of the fort. 303 Dakota men were tried on December 26 of the same year for rape and various other crimes to the civilians. Missionary Henry Whipple urged President Lincoln to take action. Under President Lincoln, 265 of these men were sentenced to prison. The remaining 38 were hanged, becoming the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. The Dakota at Fort Snelling were sent to various reservations in the spring of 1863. In July of 1863, Tawyada, or Little Crow, who had previously fled to Canada, was shot and killed. Money was offered to anyone who got the scalp of a Dakota Indian. Later, other Dakota Indians were captured. Sock pay and medicine bottle were drugged and taken to Fort Snelling. With no defense to offer or plead, they were tried and hanged for war crimes on November 11, 1865. The Dakota tribe was left in ruins. In the years of 1866 to 1887, the U.S. Indian offices helped the Dakota rebuild their scattered tribe and gave them new reservations to live on. The Dawes Act of 1887 allowed each American Indian household to receive 160 acres of land. Because land was given to every household, the leader of the family had the right to sell his land without tribal consensus. Eventually, the Indian-held land was further reduced by 2/3. Finally, Congress passed the Indian Recognition Act of 1934, which gave all Indians the right of tribal sovereignty. Today, the Dakota people unite with other Native American tribes to form the Upper and Lower Sioux communities in the state of Minnesota. The Dakota communities today commemorate the 38 men that were hanged, host the annual commemorative march to Fort Snelling, and remember the Dakota War in itself. They do not fear their past, they embrace it and give it a new meaning. They use the memories of their past to inspire and strengthen their future. The Dakota rise to conquer their past in order to take control of their future.
Itapiapi, ampetu kinde wa tachante wa shena pechu zambie. Ye kiapi mi deniye wa shichuya Darlene St. Clair makiapie. Tamakota chashaipi himataha wana chekpa untue edwati. Iche wishasha wanse wishakia himacha. St. Claude Wednesday, Wakantia, and Chpawani. So I said, my relatives, today I greet you with a good heart and a handshake. I am Ie Kiapiwi. I said my Washichu name is Darlene St. Clair. I said I'm Dakota. I'm from a place called Chanshayapi, which means they paint the trees red, which is now known as the Lower Sioux Reservation in southwestern Minnesota. And but now I live in the Twin Cities. I teach American Indian Studies. That's what I said.